Thank you all for that. My name is Blowe. I'm the coordinator of an organisation called the Network for Police Monitoring, shortly known as NetPol. I'm not an academic, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an activist, and what I want to do with my talk today is to talk specifically about some of the practical lessons that activists in Italy and elsewhere may be able to draw from the experiences of anti-fracking campaigners in the UK since 2014. We've been working with this movement since then, and one of the things that we've definitely seen is, and that we believe, is that these protests have changed the notion of what we perceive as being typical protest. Peaceful direct action is taking place in what are largely rural areas, in areas that have almost no experience of previous protests, which are largely outside of the view of the mainstream media. Unlike previous environmental mobilisations, they take place for weeks or months at a time. And as Will said, they genuinely involve a mixture of local campaigners and people who come from around the country to show their solidarity. A key feature of those protests are protest camps, which have become an important tactic for monitoring breaches of environmental regulations and for mobilising local support. Now, as Will said, there has been ample evidence that the police response has been invariably incredibly aggressive. And campaign groups have also had to deal with many of the legal manoeuvres that the industry has come up with and which Will has already described. However, there is something else which is important, which is that what are invariably first-time campaigners continually tell us that they feel what they describe as the overwhelming power of the state concentrating down on them. And that's because the police are using incredibly sophisticated and advanced intelligence gathering techniques to try and build up a picture of the movement that they're part of, the size of the movement, the leadership, who the alliances are, what the structures are within those groups. And it's partly because they've crossed the line that Will's referred to. They're no longer just protesters, they've become activists. Over the last 15 years in particular, the government and the police in the UK have been very successful in portraying anybody holding what might be perceived as a minority point of view as being somehow linked with extremism or with violence. For most members of the public, we've actually reached a situation where it's almost impossible to think about the idea of radicalisation without some association with terrorism or association that is overtly negative. And that's partly because of the work that's been done by the police. There is a model that's now developed of categorising a growing number of non-violent campaigns as being what they describe as at risk of becoming domestic extremists. That's the term that's used. Unlike the definition of terrorism, which is written into law, domestic extremism isn't. There isn't a clear definition or robust definition of what it actually means. And so as a result, the classification by the police of an increasing number of non-violent social movements as a supposed threat has justified the intensification of surveillance and even disruption of their actions. And significantly, because domestic extremism isn't clear, it is used as a it's very helpful for the police in order to be able to use it, because it means pretty much whatever they want it to mean. In practical terms, what that means for the campaigners that we work with is everybody who goes on a protest is photographed. People are routinely filmed driving to and from a protest. Prominent campaigners are regularly visited at home, unannounced, uninvited officers arriving at their homes. We have young campaigners, in particular teenagers, who are identified as being, quotes, vulnerable to radicalisation, whose parents are visited by counter-terrorism police. We have seen evidence suggesting that police are deliberately seeking to disrupt protests by targeting protesters who are seen as being more vulnerable. Will mentioned particular targeting of women, but also teenagers, people with disabilities. It's unfortunate you couldn't have seen the film. There's a young man in the film who is in a wheelchair, who's regularly out on the front line at Preston Road in Lancashire. And in the film, you see the police pushing him out of his wheelchair into the road, which is shocking. What's more shocking is that that's happened 7 times, and that he's continually arrested. And in part, what people say is that they feel that that tactic is used to encourage other people to become angry in order to then intervene, and that justifies the use of further arrests. What overall all this feels like, and this is what people have told us continuously, is harassment and intimidation. It's deliberate harassment and intimidation. And as a consequence of using these tactics, it has an effect, what we call a chilling effect, on freedom of protest. It makes people think twice about whether they want to turn up and participate. And there's very good evidence to suggest that that is deliberate. What it's also done is it's shifted the operational priorities of the senior officers that are running those, the policing of those protests. So it's no longer a priority for them to try and mediate, find compromises, because making arrests is often very valuable as a way of being able to gather new intelligence. So that's a fairly bleak picture. What I really want to talk about next is the lessons, and in particular lessons from that are directed more towards things that are useful for other campaigners. And the first lesson is around what I've called activist trauma. So the circumstances that I've outlined are obviously incredibly dramatic, but many of the campaigners that I've spoken to have been unprepared for the emotional trauma of constantly being under surveillance, constantly facing the physical trauma of being repeatedly arrested, the violence they experience from the police. And all of this has an impact on how effective they can be in their protest, the strength of their solidarity within their groups, the ability to avoid people becoming basically exhausted and dropping out from participation in those campaigns. Because those protests have got a longevity to them, part of the problem is that they also attract people who are already pushed from the margins of society, and who bring with them pre-existing, sometimes disruptive or self-destructive behaviour. And in some cases that involves things like people who have been homeless before, or have got alcohol or drug use, which has been something which has been seen since protesters have been focusing on occupying space. So the Occupy movement in 2011-12 definitely there was an issue for those campaigners. So as a response, there has been an increasing focus on the need to put well-being, both in terms of space but also processes and support in place at an early stage of planning the activities that campaigners are going to do. are looking at issues about accountability within their own groups and accountabilities, for instance, within a camp. Thinking about organising support for people who are detained, just making sure that if somebody is taken to a police station, when they're released, there are people waiting outside with, a glass of wine and some cake or something. But something to make sure that some thought has gone into their well-being. The second area, and I think this is one that is more directly involved in some of Netpol's work, is around legal support. So legal support isn't just about finding lawyers. Campaigners who are dealing with, in what these instances are daily protests over months, are invariably ill-prepared to do the basic work of documenting and making sense of the huge amounts of evidence of police violence and brutality. And that information is absolutely essential for the defence of people who are subsequently prosecuted. They also need to ensure that everybody who's taking part in those protests has a basic understanding of their rights. Another important lesson is the need to have people on the ground who are undertaking the role of monitoring what the police are doing and how they behave, what happens when arrests are made. And in the UK we have a network of what are called legal observers who are constant presence at anti-fracking protests. They're not lawyers, they're unpaid, they rarely have any form of legal specialism, and they don't give legal advice. What they're there to do is to document all aspects of the police operation, provide a reassuring presence, and to be the counter to the fact that the police are there gathering vast amounts of information and filming. They're gathering evidence. They're the other side. They're there to make sure that there is somebody else that's gathering information about what the police are doing, because obviously that isn't being recorded. One of the things about this role and what makes it important is that campaigners who don't feel able to be involved in the more indirect action are able to participate in something which is having a meaningful impact in terms of supporting others. And although they're not immune from arrest, there has been a recognition by the police that legal observers are somehow separate from the role of the protesters. So we have a network of regional volunteer-led organisations under the umbrella of a group which is called Green and Black Cross, who coordinate the training, work with legal representatives to collate the evidence. I'm involved in some of the training of those volunteers. And yesterday I looked in my bag and I discovered that I have the pack that I carry with me all the time, just in case I need to do some legal observing. So we have, the observers are clearly identified with, so there are bibs, so it's very clear what their role is. And we also make sure that everybody who is participating in a protest gets access to a simple, small card which has got some basic information about their rights and a telephone number that they can contact if they're arrested. It may not seem like very much, but that role is absolutely essential in making sure, it makes the difference between whether people subsequently, who are arrested, subsequently are prosecuted, and if they are prosecuted, whether they're convicted. So the final thing is more directly the role that Netpol undertakes, which is countering the negative portrayal of protesters in the media. Campaign groups obviously want to make sure that the core messages that they're trying to get across are not diverted by having to expend time and resources on trying to counter or to talk about the fact that they are being brutalised by the police. And obviously dealing with the media involves conducting research. It means talking about police tactics, talking about police policies, highlighting the stories of abuses of human rights, in an attempt to try and provide an alternative story to the overwhelmingly negative narratives about the exercise of rights of protest that would otherwise be the dominant ones. This isn't really part of a legal strategy. It is advocacy on behalf of the movements that we work with. It's about challenging the stories that the police tell. It's about challenging the stories that industry come up with. And that's more the role that I take on and Netpol takes on. It is about, it's a different type of human rights work, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not about taking cases to court. It's about making sure that a group doesn't get overwhelmed with dealing with the brutality of the state, so it can still focus its energy and time on talking to the public and talking to the media about the issue which is important to it, the environmental damage that it's challenging. And the reason why I think all of these types of support are very important is because social movements are not a series of actions. They are communities themselves. And communities need infrastructure. They need the support to be in place to make sure that they are effective. And the state is not going to provide that. We have to find a way to be able to provide that for ourselves. And that means thinking about it in advance. Thank you for listening.